Hey everyone, welcome to Tenian's Corner. I'm Jesse. I'm very excited to be here today with my brother. And would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Dan.
This is a new segment we're introducing on my channel where we want to get together and select a movie to talk about. It could be every week, every month, or whenever we have the time to do it. And it could be anything. Could be a indie film, could be classic cinema, a new release, a genre film. We're also open to hearing what our viewers are interested in, what they would like to hear us talk about. So, without further ado, let's get into it. And the movie for today's discussion is a horror film called The Evil Within. Came out in 2017. I'd never heard of this movie before until you drew my attention to it.
It was on my news feed when I pop up my browser. I get a lot of clickbait, and there's a
Mm,
lot of stuff about movies because I'm always looking them up, and I watch a lot of movies, and I watch a lot of horror movies. So this one, a news story came up around this one, and
mm.
it scored. I didn't fact check this, but apparently it like scored like an amazing Rotten Tomato score. Like the people who've actually been reviewing the movies on the movie on Rotten Tomatoes really appreciate it.
And I was as interested by the production history of the film as much as the film itself, which was written and directed by Andrew Getty. He was the grandson of oil tycoon J. Paul Getty from this billionaire family. And he spent 15 years of his life making this movie and then had an untimely death. And I think he died in 2015 and didn't live to see the release of the movies. They're very tragic. The movie, The Evil Within, is about this mentally challenged kid named Dennis being taken care of by his older brother, John. His brother, John, gets him this fancy mirror and it has supernatural powers. And when he looks at his reflection, he sees an evil twin double of himself who starts telling him to kill people. And that's the basic plot of the movie. And I want to talk about like the first opening scene of the film, which I thought was really interesting. It opens in the context of a dream that Dennis is having about his mom, and they go to this fair. Like any good horror film, it puts you into this state of like anxiety. This is very surreal, very weird, very uncomfortable. Yeah, so I want to know, like, what was your first impression, reaction?
Really similar. Um, I thought that the voiceover was striking because he plays the parts of all the characters.
I'm ready. Are you sure you're ready?
It has this uncanny, almost ventriloquist doll effect, and kind of anticipates something that happens later in the film, of course.
The actor Frederick Cooler, he did he I thought he did a good job.
I think it's an exceptional performance, and I think it's a really fascinating performance for a number of reasons, especially compared to the other characters and the other actors in the film. To
Yeah.
me, I thought one of the things that was most interesting about the film is that he seems like the only human character in the whole story.
Mm.
So that's ironic because he's worried about his humanity. He thinks his subjectivity and his mind, they're compromised. He doesn't know how things work. He's kind of this marginalized, ostracized character, or at least he feels himself to be. And yet in the film, he's the only one that seems like remotely human to me. The other characters are just two-dimensional cutouts of types. Like his brother is, and his brother's girlfriend Lydia are just such dry vanilla types. Whether it's just a function of bad acting or whatever, he just doesn't ever seem like a really fleshed out, rounded character. He seems very much like an empty type. And I actually don't think that's a function of bad writing. I think that has to do with the whole motif of dreams and whether or not any of this is actually real, whether Dennis is just trapped in his unconscious.
John Peterson, who plays his older brother, I didn't think he was terrible, but the actor who plays him, Sean Patrick Flannery, did you recognize him?
I've seen him in things. I should have looked him up, but
Yeah,
not really.
when I was watching, I was like, huh, he reminds me of someone, or he looks recognizable. I looked him up, and he was in the Young Indiana Jones series from the '90s. His character wasn't that well written. Like there's a scene where Dennis is coming up, just having, I think, killing some children. He's coming up from the basement and he has like a worker's outfit on and a belt with tools on it. And he's a bunch of library books about taxidermy, forensics, disturbing shit. And John says to him, is concerned, like, "Oh, why do you have books like that?" And then Dennis says, "Oh, I got the wrong library books." And then John is this, "Oh, okay." Uh,
Yeah.
like you got a basement, you got tools, you have books on forensics. You're probably a serial killer. So I thought his character was written a little stupid, and so that was like unconvincing.
I mean, especially I think going back to John and Lydia. I mean, I think one of the things that sticks. I know those actors can act. Lydia, I don't know if you recognize her. She was in Starship Troopers, and
Dina
she's been in a number of
Mayer,
things.
Dinah or Dina Mayer, yeah, Starship. Yeah, I remember
Yeah, and then and I mean the act Patrick Flan John Patrick, what was his name? Sean Patrick Flannery.
John Patrick Flannery.
Sean, yeah, I know they can act. I've seen them in other things, or they can be quite good.
Yeah, the whole chemistry dynamic and the very logic of how the characters relate in this movie, it follows a dream logic.
Again, I think it goes back in some way to the slasher film subgenre because I remember watching Terrifier 2. The only human character to me was the central female protagonist.
Hmm.
Her brother and her mother were both like, and again, this may have just been an aspect of just bad wooden acting in the case of that film. I don't know if that was intentional, but they were not. I felt no connection with them at all. Like the brother really could. I don't think that actor could really act, and then the mom really couldn't act either. So again, the identities of her friends and especially her immediate family are really attenuated to the point where you're left grasping on her because she actually has some humanity. And so
Yeah,
the Dennis character is really similar. He's all you got in this film in terms of a kind of
yeah,
shred of what feels like actual humanity.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, if anyone's seen like Terrifier 2, the mom in that movie, in most of their scenes, she's yelling and screaming and coming off really over the top and exaggerated and campy in the genre of the disability genre that you find in Hollywood. With you got the mentally challenged character, but then you have the beautiful people around them. It even takes that away from you because John and Lydia, there's something always uncanny there about every character in the movie that is alienating.
yeah, and I mean the whole question of ableism in the film and what the film's relationship to mental handicaps and disabilities is a really complicated one, right? I mean, I think the horror genre kind of constrains the relationship you can have with disability because horror is inherently conservative. Horror is obsessed with normality and abnormality. It works in binaries, right? There's the proper and the improper. There's the messy, abject body and the clean and proper body. Um, and so the film treats Dennis very sympathetically. And like I said, he feels like the only human character to me. And yet at the same time, the focal point of the horror is associated with disability, with abnormality, both in the figure of Dennis, but also in the figure of the cadaver, played by a person who actually has a genetic disability or a genetic abnormality.
This nightmare figure, he's just called the Cadaver in like the script, but he's played by Michael Berryman. People might recognize him from movies like The Hills Have Eyes. He's been a bunch of horror films.
If you know anything about horror and you consider yourself a horror fan, you'll recognize him um, because he turns up all over the place.
He assaults Dennis in a nightmare, and he attaches a zipper onto the back of his skin and then zips his skin off like a piece of clothing and then dons his flesh and then becomes his evil doppelganger.
And so it's like, on the one hand, yeah, we're trying to tell a meaningful story about a rounded character with a mental disability, but at the same time, disability is on display as a real problem. It's the source of the horror. There are other currents of horror in the film, but that's the dominant one.
Dennis is kind of an incel character, and
Yeah, absolutely.
the way he appeals to incel mentality and culture. There's a whole subplot between Dennis and this ice cream counter girl, Susan, I think her name is. She ends up being one of his murder victims. Like, there's this whole scene where Dennis is talking to his evil double in the mirror about how to impress her, attract her, he has to resort to violence and become like a serial killer because women find that hot. That ties into a lot of the views of incel culture where there's this sexual entitlement to women and then this feeling of powerlessness and helplessness. A man will have to resort to like misogynistic violence to regain control and assert his dominance. And that's like a theme of the film. And it reminded, this film really reminded me, I don't know if you've seen Todd Phillips' Joker.
Not yet. No, I really want to.
Arthur Fleck, the character in that, has been described as an incel character to appealing to incel culture. Of course, that film was very much inspired by Taxi Driver, another incel drama. They self-actualize themselves, become themselves through resorting to extreme violence. Particularly more so in this film, Evil Within, is women become the targets of that violence.
It indexes a powerful horror pedigree in like the second half of the 20th century. Modern horror is really indebted to that. I mean, the original incel, of course, is Norman Bates from Psycho, and that's the granddaddy for the slasher film, the kind of text. And so one of the things that was really occurring to me as I was watching the film is that, you know, whatever else Getty was, he was clearly a connoisseur of horror, is aware of these conventions, these tropes that have built up over time. Because the Dennis character, and this is where the ableism of the film, I think, comes into play, is, you know, very much like the monsters from slasher films, the Jason Voorhees and the Leatherfaces. As terrifying and as murderous as they are, in a kind of weird, distorted way, this is them trying to engage in what they see as symbolically appropriate behavior and what you call self-actualization.
Society is a symbolic order, and Dennis, in a grotesque way, wants to become normal like everyone else.
It's funny you should mention the Joker, because what the cadaver says to him sounds very similar to what the Joker in The Dark Knight says to Harvey Dent when he's trying to corrupt him and turn him into Two-Face. He says that, you know, people are fine with as long as there's a plan, even if the plan is horrifying. You know, so as long as something's happening according to an acceptable symbolic script, everything is copacetic, even if people are dying, even if crimes against humanity are being committed. As long as it's part of the script, it's fine.
He wants the beautiful girlfriend. That's very normal, and we can understand that. What we don't accept is, unfortunately, he just has to kill her to get her. That dark undercurrent lying behind it, that these structures are upheld through these dark tendencies towards violence and self-destruction.
There's an inkling that it isn't just these lone individuals, these sick, monstrous killers. There's something fundamentally out of whack about the order they inhabit. The order itself is sort of sick. So you think about the John Saxon sheriff character in A Nightmare on Elm Street. I feel the same way about the therapist character in this film. There's this more than implied malevolence that just comes out that can't be fully explained just by the presence of the cadaver. There's something else going on that renders this whole space, the whole mise-en-scène of the film, is just fucked. There's something fundamentally wrong. We got to get to the bottom of this. We never do, right? The whole idea of getting to the bottom is part of the problem in this film.
And as much as the figure of the disabled character is problematic in the movie, it makes that sense of disability and extends it to our very sense of self and reality.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of something a professor of mine said in class, is that from a psychoanalytical perspective, a psychotic person is somebody who just sees things far too clearly. And maybe that, in a way, that's kind of Dennis's dilemma, that unlike the other characters, he sees things really, really clearly. He kind of sees an element, an aspect of quote unquote reality that the other characters are not a party to, and that's what he can't get out of. But none of them can get out of it. It's just a question of how self-aware you are about your existential dilemma, I guess.
A lot of it is very earnest, and there's some philosophy behind the movie, and the themes really hit. I mean, other times it plays out like a B movie.
There are also moments that are just incredibly like laugh out funny.
Like even in that scene of John talking about the octopus animatronic puppet.
Very simple ones. See the wires attached to the tentacle? Well, they go up past the curtain where we can't see them into a big plastic tube with a bunch of discs on it.
He's describing the apparatus behind the illusion in great depth and detail to Dennis. It's like, where did that come from? And that was not natural or organic to what you expected his character would say.
How does he know that? I mean, what does he even do? Isn't he real estate?
I forget what he does.
I don't know. It's not. He doesn't make puppets or animatronic things for a living. I mean, I know that. So how does he know all this?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. I mean, again, is he an avatar in at that point in Dennis's dream world?
like you mentioned the one with the octopus, which is funny, but for me, it's when his brother gives him the mirror, and
Okay.
it's like, "Hey, man, big damn mirror, go crazy," you know? It's like,
That
"Oh yeah, thanks,
that was
big
great.
damn mirror. What the fuck am I supposed to do with
Yeah,
this?"
yeah. That was funny. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, you're referring to in the beginning of the movie where Dennis gets the mirror, and
Yeah,
his brother is saying he just puts it in the middle of the room and says some shit about, oh, I'm selling a place, I want to furnish it with nice fancy things, and you got to have this mirror. And Dennis saying, I don't want the freaking mirror.
yeah, you want the fucking mirror, you
I,
do,
I mean, it takes up the whole room.
and it's this terrifying looking gothic thing.
Andrew Getty had poured like a lot of money into doing the special effects, and in fact, he demarcated a special section of his mansion to do a lot of the in-house effects.
One of the other things that's really interesting about the film is that it wasn't made by a trained filmmaker, um, and it was all personally financed. So
Mhm.
obviously, because he came from this tremendous wealth, he was able to infuse a significant budget into it. But you can see that it's not composed or constructed or written the way that you know a quote unquote professional polished piece would be, and that's one of the things that I think makes it the special kind of uniquely cinematic thing that it is, because it is clearly this personal obsession crafted by somebody who was technically an amateur. Which is not to say anything against it. I think that's one of the things that works in its favor. It reminds me of that a book we used to have that we would look at a lot about so-called outsider art, and that was some of my favorite paintings and other kinds of art that I'd ever seen, precisely because it looked so different than the stuff that was being composed by people who came from this, highly trained, acculturated background. Um, that it was clearly this stuff was the product of this overriding personal obsession that was written or composed in a personal style, and it just had this grip on you as a result of that.
It was fascinating to read about the history of it, the Getty family, and the fact that this grandson of this oil tycoon spent 15 years obsessing and making this horror film that when you see it, you see the cover of it, this looks like a generic B horror film. It's unlike anything I've seen, and I'm a big proponent of practical effects, and they were very well done here. Horror fans or cinephiles, I would recommend watching it.
Bears reviewing. I mean, it is a unique piece of art, right? I mean, I'm not sure it counts as good movie making from a kind of conventional classical perspective, but it's a one of a kind experience.